Okay, so now we are recording. I just got my Wi-Fi and internet connection service back like months ago, and it's a little jittery. Um, so if something happens during this recording, during this meeting, and we get cut off, that's most likely due to my connection here. There's not a whole lot of new things I'm going to say today. It's mostly just layering on some details of what I've already covered. But it is stuff that I will expect you to know. So without further ado, I'm just going to start cranking this out. So I'm going to go to a whiteboard. And I know I already went through muscle metabolism, the ways in which a muscle accumulates, stores, and uses ATP. I'm just going to quickly go through that. This is mostly review, but I might say a few new things. So this is just muscle metabolism conclusion. Let me get my board closer to me so I can actually write legibly. I'm just going to write conclusion. So we already know that a muscle uses ATP basically in 4 ways, and excuse me, and in this order. So first, of course, it's stored ATP. Muscles fibers have the ability to store ATP, and that's what gets used first in order to basically just start a contraction. Second, direct phosphorylation. So after those ATPs start being used up, there is a way to rephosphorylate them, meaning stick that terminal phosphate back onto the ADP, and that, remember, the substrate that is used to donate that phosphate is creatine phosphate. Then number 3 is an anaerobic pathway, which is glycolysis, which happens fairly quickly, and it can produce new ATP, but so I'm just going to put fast, but it's not very efficient. So it yields 2 ATP per glucose molecule. So it's quick, but it doesn't give us a lot of ATP. Finally, aerobic in the presence of oxygen, and that's cellular respiration. This takes a long time, so it's not fast, it's slow, but it yields us about 32 net ATP per glucose molecule. So it's really efficient, but it takes a while, and it's quite slow. So here's a quick picture of everything that happens in that cell. If this is a muscle cell, I'm just going to I'm not going to go through steps 1 and 2. I'm going to go through steps 3 and 4 very quickly again. So if we have glucose that we've ingested, say, it's in our bloodstream, when the glucose molecule gets transported across the cellular membrane, that's really when it first gets broken down. So this in the absence of oxygen. So glycolysis, the process of glycolysis occurs right here. So I'm just going to write glycolysis. I'm going to put in parentheses, no oxygen, and it gives us 2 ATP. So as that glucose gets transported across the membrane, it gets broken into pieces, 2 pieces, and that gives us 2 ATP. Now, the result, the product of that breakdown is this pyruvic acid, or I'm just going to write pyruvate. And so converting glucose to pyruvate as it goes across the membrane gives us 2 ATPs. It's in the absence of oxygen. Now, if we have oxygen present, step 4 up here, this aerobic process is just a continuation of step 3. So step 3 occurs if we don't have any oxygen coming into the cell. Step 4 occurs if we do have oxygen in our bloodstream coming into the cell. Here's a mitochondria in the cell, in a muscle cell. Let me label that. So step 3 and 4 are actually processes. Step 4 is a continuation process of step 3 if we have oxygen present. And what happens is the pyruvate goes to the mitochondria. That's our energy source from our glucose. The oxygen also goes to the mitochondria. And this is where the mitochondria is where cellular respiration actually occurs. There are other sources we can use to do cellular respiration other than glucose. We can use fatty acids, so lipids. So I'll just write fatty acids can also be used, as well as amino acids from proteins. So we can break down proteins and we can break down fats. It doesn't always have to be sugar as the energy source, but that is usually a longer process. That's why all textbooks use glucose. Glucose is the easiest and fastest way that the body does this process. So most textbooks use glucose as the primary example. Nevertheless, so glucose to pyruvate is the process of glycolysis, and it occurs in the absence of oxygen, and we get 2 ATP. If we do have oxygen in our bloodstream, that goes to the mitochondria. The pyruvate from glycolysis goes to the mitochondria, and we get some byproducts. I said this yesterday, that I think we get water as a byproduct, as an exhaust product, carbon dioxide, which we eventually have to get rid of. And what we're most concerned here is the cell makes about 32 ATP molecules. That's what the muscle needs in order to sustain contraction. So that's what I wanted to go over. By the way, this 32 number, just so you know, it includes these first two. That 32 ATP is a net. It's a very complicated process. This is the Reader's Digest, the Cliff Notes version. During this whole process of cellular respiration, which is very complex, it uses some ATP and cranks out more ATP than it uses. This 32 number is a net gain of 32 ATP from that whole process. So if oxygen is present in muscle cells, the muscle cell will use the aerobic pathway to produce its ATP and sustain a contraction. So I'm going to layer over this. So I'm just going to write that when oxygen is present, that's what the muscle will prefer to use because it's most efficient. I'm just writing the muscle cell uses aerobic. So most of the things that we do, the reason I'm saying this is most of the activities that we do throughout our day, just normal living, climbing a set of stairs, lifting objects, all that stuff, the vast majority of those processes are done with aerobic cellular respiration. Why? Because we're always breathing. We have oxygen present in our system. Let's just say you go for try to do a sustained activity, athletic activity. When the exercise demands that you're putting on your muscle cells exceed the ability of the cell to produce enough ATP, your body then will go to anaerobic processes to try to sustain that activity. So when we first start any activity, we use step 1, stored ATP, then our muscle cells quickly go to step 2, direct phosphorylation. Then we do some glycolysis, but usually all of us, when we start any sort of activity, we breathe in and out, breathe in and out. So we're getting oxygen into our system. Our muscles quickly go to step 4 to do any sort of sustained activity. Now let's push that to the limit. Let's say we keep doing step 4, step 4, step 4, and we're breathing super heavy and we want to continue that, sustain that activity. We will revert, our muscle cells will revert back to step 3 to help contribute to producing, it will recruit glycolysis or anaerobic respiration in order to sustain that activity. So the length of time that a muscle can continue to contract using aerobic pathways, we talk about something called aerobic endurance. So I'm going to write that out. There's a term called aerobic endurance. It refers to how long we can sustain an activity. How long a muscle can continue contractions using cellular respiration, or I'm going to say aerobic pathways. The reason I'm writing pathways with an S is because technically it can use glucose as a substrate, as an energy source, or fats or proteins. We mostly just talked about glucose. And then this term, the anaerobic threshold, this term refers to the point when the muscle converts back to an anaerobic pathway. It starts recruiting this pathway after it can't keep up just with aerobic pathways. When it calls on anaerobic glycolysis or anaerobic measures to contribute to the ATP production, we call that the anaerobic threshold. So I'm just going to say the point when a muscle converts, I'm going to say back to anaerobic pathway, and we know what that is. That's glycolysis. Okay, so I wanted to go over, reintroduce some more detail onto that stuff. I'm going to talk a tiny bit more about some athletic activities, just so you have a good handle, because I'm going to ask you a few questions about this on the next quiz. Specific activities, just so we can put this into real context. Things like a sprinter, so I'm going to write sprinting. Usually we think of that as running. It can also be a swimming sprinter as well. But things like sprinting, weightlifters, even diving. These activities specifically rely on number 1, ATP stored in the muscle, and pretty much number 2, direct phosphorylation. Because if you think about it, if we go back to our last lecture, stored ATP can give us about 4 to 6 seconds worth of contraction. Direct phosphorylation up to about 15 seconds. And a 100-meter dash sprinter world-class sprinters can do that in less than 10 seconds. Weightlifters usually don't take longer than a few seconds to get weights above their head or whatever they're doing. Same with divers, so these activities last they're for short bursts, I'm gonna write bursts, and usually involve some sort of strength. So I'm just gonna write power. Now, slightly longer athletic activities. things like, well, this is a lot longer. I'm going to just list some things like soccer, tennis, or a bit longer swimming. So I think your book uses 100-meter swim as an example. These activities, basically, of course, they get started with number 1 and 2. So 1 and 2 to start, but they need a bit longer sustaining muscle contraction. So they rely then almost entirely on the anaerobic pathway. So I'm just going to say then rely almost entirely on anaerobic, and you know that as glycolysis. Happens fairly quickly, but produces only 2 ATP per glucose molecule. Finally, something like a marathon runner, or even if you or I, even though we're not marathon runners, at least I assume you're not, I know I'm not, but if we decide we want to try to go for like a 3-mile run or even a 5-mile run, longer sustained, much longer sustained activities, this is almost, it goes through steps 1, 2, and 3 very quickly when you just take your first few steps and then you run for maybe your first few yards. But almost after that, it's almost entirely, because we have access to oxygen and we can breathe, almost entirely on aerobic. And that would be cellular respiration. All right. Next topic is I wanted to mention, in this context of activity, physical activity, I did want to mention muscle fatigue. We've all experienced some sort of muscle fatigue, even doing everyday activities. First, I have to preface this conversation with, it's not entirely understood, at least to my knowledge, anything that I've read. We don't have a really super firm handle on what causes different types of muscle fatigue. But when you see this term, just think of the muscles' inability to contract. If you're not familiar with the term muscle fatigue, I know most of you already are. Usually after some sort of activity, your muscles become unable to sustain that activity. And here's what we think, the best that we know of what's going on. First, ATP availability is, once was thought to be a factor, is not thought to be a factor in typical exercise muscle fatigue. So I just wanted to say that, and here are some causes as best we know. First, intracellular potassium, that's a K+. Those are potassium ions. Intracellular potassium gets lost in sustained muscle activity. That's due to repolarization of muscle cells. And I'm just going to say, and what it does is it accumulates, it's supposed to be an A, accumulates in the T tubules, inside of those transverse tubules. What that does is it messes up T-tubule function. And so I'm going to draw an arrow down and just say this interferes with calcium ion release from those terminal cisternae of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I'm just going to write up SR, that means sarcoplasmic reticulum. So we think that intracellular potassium deficit and going to T-tubules is a serious contributing factor to muscle fatigue. I'm still talking about muscle fatigue. Empower short burst exercises. So I'm just going to write empower exercises. Quite possibly this is what's going on. There's been shown during research, there is an accumulation of what they call inorganic phosphates. I'm just going to write phosphates. And this is from the creatine phosphate molecule. Constant breakdown. That enzyme creatine kinase goes to work like crazy and starts breaking down creatine phosphate like crazy, and we get an accumulation of these inorganic phosphate molecules. In addition, so that's one contributing factor in power exercises. So I'm going to put plus. ATP breakdown. The process of ATP breakdown during power exercises may interfere with calcium release into the cell as well from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And finally, just so you know, when I was in your seat, when I was a student, it was always thought that lactic acid buildup in a muscle was a major contributing factor to muscle fatigue, especially in power exercises. Now it's not, so I'm just going to write lactic acid buildup is now probably thought not to be a major factor. The whole conclusion of this is that short burst fatigue exercises. So let me go to a new page and just write this out for you so that you kind of have it on record. During short burst exercises, we're still talking about muscle fatigue here. So I'm just writing short burst ionic disruptions. So let me erase that. I'm going to write disruptions. in the excitation, contraction, coupling. So whenever we say that there's a deficit of calcium ions, that interferes with this excitation, contraction, coupling. Obviously, that would interfere with uncovering the active sites on actin so that myosin could bind to it. So the muscle becomes unable to contract because myosin can't attach itself to actin. During long-term exercises, this is just a conclusion statement. Really, what we said was the process of having a damaged, I'll write it out, sarcoplasmic reticulum. That is what interferes with calcium release. Okay. Couple more terms. This is not going to be a long lecture today. That was just layering on some more detail about the aerobic pathway, and then some terms that have to do with exercises. There's a term in your book, and I will ask you probably at least a couple questions about this. EPOC or EPOC, what this acronym stands for is excess post exercise oxygen consumption. So what this long convoluted term refers to is after we're done exercising, what's going on in the body, with specifically referring to aerobic pathways, aerobic respiration. So when you're finished, let's just say you run a marathon, what's going on in your body after you stop to restore the muscle back to a muscle's response, the restorative processes that go on in your body. So after a prolonged exercise, what needs to happen for a muscle to return to its normal state, its normal resting state? And here's what's going on. The oxygen reserves, and what we mean is within the muscle cell, the oxygen molecules that are bound to myoglobin must be reestablished. So we have to fix that problem after prolonged exercise, get our oxygen reserves back. The accumulation of lactic acid remember, lactic acid is a byproduct of the anaerobic pathway of glycolysis, and that builds up in the muscle cell. So the accumulation of lactic acid, it must be taken care of. It must be converted to pyruvic acid, aka pyruvate, or transported to the liver and broken down to glucose and glycogen. I'm just going to say transported to liver for breakdown. And what that means is that breakdown process, what the liver can do is it can break down it basically goes in reverse. The liver has the ability to convert pyruvate back to glucose and or store that glucose as glycogen. So also it needs, so we just kind of said this, but this is the muscle's glycogen stores need to be replenished. And finally, ATP stores also need. And I'm going to say ATP stores and creatine phosphate also. So these terms, well, these products, these stored molecules should be very familiar to you now. What glycogen is just a stored form of sugar, of glucose. We know what ATP is and what it's used for. We know what creatine phosphate is and what it's used for. We know that lactic acid is a byproduct, a waste product that something needs to be done with that. And obviously we know what oxygen is used for. All require oxygen uptake. So all of these processes, I don't want to go to a new board here. I'm just going to say all of these require oxygen uptake in order to happen. So you've been alive long enough to know that when you exercise, when you're immediately done exercising, you continue to breathe heavily. And that's what's going on here, is during this excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, that's what's going on in your body. That the reason you're breathing heavily is that your body is doing these things. The amount of oxygen that you need post-exercise to restore these processes, all of these things in the body, that's what this means. So I'm going to draw one last arrow down here. So excess post-exercise oxygen consumption refers to the amount of O2 needed to accomplish these restorative processes, to accomplish these things. All right, I think we're on to the last mini topic, and then I will be done. So this is nice and quick. So let me layer over this. And finally, I'm just going to talk about a muscles. I did touch on this in yesterday's lecture. So this is just a little more detail. Remember yesterday, we went over the 3 basic types of muscle fibers in the human body: fast, oxidative, those were the intermediate ones. There was fast glycolytic, fast oxidative, and slow aerobic. So I'm just going to go through, I'm going to apply those muscle fibers to different activities. So I'm going to write endurance, exercise. Here's what's going on inside of the muscle. So I'll write that. We know that an endurance exercise uses mostly slow oxidative fibers to accomplish this task, and we know that aerobic respiration is going on, but there are other things that are going on inside of the muscle. There's an increase in the capillary network, vascularization around the individual fibers. So we do build and increase a blood supply. So let's just say you're a jogger, you're a long distance runner. Over time, these things build up in your muscles. There's an increase also in the number of mitochondria in individual fibers. So by exercising, endurance exercising, we can increase blood flow to that muscle. We can increase the number of mitochondria in each individual cell. And we can also increase the amount of myoglobin in the fibers. Remember, myoglobin binds and stores oxygen. So all of these 3 things make sense. This occurs mostly in slow oxidative fibers. Because those are the ones that are used the most during that activity. Individual muscle metabolism becomes more efficient over time. Still talking about endurance exercise. So I'm just going to write that individual muscle metabolism. What does that mean? Individual muscle fibers get better at using oxygen and whatever energy source they need to make ATP. That's what it means. So individual muscle metabolism becomes more efficient, and that's mostly due to these three things happening in the fiber. And that causes or gives the benefit of greater endurance. This is what's going on when people say somebody's getting into shape. That's supposed to be in air quotes. So the muscles get greater endurance over time. They gain greater strength over time and are more resistant to fatigue. So that's endurance exercises. Now I'm just going to talk about what happens, and you know what happens, but I'm going to reiterate then what happens during resistance exercising. So I'm going to lay over this for our last page. I'll put a star here since I did on the last one. And you can guess what's coming. I mentioned it yesterday when we talked about the different fiber types. But during resistance exercise, you know that this is what causes it's responsible for muscle hypertrophy, the muscles getting bigger. So this is building big muscles or building muscle mass, not necessarily building endurance. Here's what goes on. You know that the muscle, we all know that the muscle, well, maybe not all of us, muscle fibers increase in size. And I'm going to reiterate that we don't get an increase in the actual number of fibers in the cell. Just each individual fiber gets bigger. But we do get an increase in mitochondria, the number of mitochondria in each cell. We also, this is really significant, we do increase the number of myofibrils within each fiber. Remember, a myofibril is a specialized organelle that contains myofilaments. So we're also increasing the number of, I need to move down here. Just to remind you, myofilaments, think myosin and actin. Titin is also, that elastin is also a myofilament. We didn't talk about that very much. It just allows a muscle to recoil. But this increase in myofilaments is mostly actin, the number of actin and myosin molecules. We also get an increase in glycogen stores. All of these contribute to the hypertrophy. We get an increase in connective tissue around each individual fiber. That contributes to the size, as well as the strength and stability. That's kind of between the cells and between the cells. And we get the conversion of fast oxidative fibers to fast glycolytic fibers. So those intermediate fibers can be converted to the fast glycolytic, the power fibers. But just a reminder to you, once these activities cease, then those fast oxidative fibers, or which were once converted to these, will go back to their original state. If you decide, you don't want to be a power lifter or a bodybuilder anymore, doing resistance exercise. All right, I'm going to cut off. That's it for today. That should conclude what you need to know for Monday's quiz. So I'm going to stop my recording.